Chapter 1. The Garden's Whisper. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The formless void hung heavy with silence until His voice spoke light into being, and the darkness parted like waters before a divine hand. He gathered the seas into their places and raised the dry land, clothing it in green. He set the sun to rule the day and the moon to govern the night, scattering stars across the velvet dome as if flinging jewels from an open palm. And when all was ordered and good, He formed man from the dust of the ground, breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, so that he became a living soul. Yet even this was not enough. God looked upon the man, Adam, and saw that he was alone. From his side, He fashioned a companion, drawing forth bone and flesh and spirit, and presented her to him. She opened her eyes to a world of unbroken wonder, and in that first glance she knew she was loved beyond measure. Her name was Eve, and she was the crown of creation. The Garden of Eden stretched before them like a living dream. Rivers flowed from a single source, parting into 4 great streams that watered every corner of paradise. The Pishon wound through lands rich with gold and onyx. The Gihon curved past ancient hills. The Tigris and Euphrates carried the fragrance of distant cedars. Trees rose tall and graceful, their leaves whispering secrets to the breeze, their fruit heavy and perfect. Pomegranates splitting open to reveal ruby seeds, figs bursting with sweetness, dates hanging like amber beads. Flowers bloomed in colors no mortal eye has seen since, deep violets that drank the light, whites so pure they seemed to glow from within, golds that shimmered as though kissed by the sun itself. Birds of iridescent plumage darted among the branches, their songs rising in harmonious praise. Lions reclined beside lambs, and neither hunger nor fear troubled any creature. Eve moved through this abundance with the ease of one born to it. Her skin was warm and golden in the perpetual light, her hair falling in dark waves that caught the sunlight like polished obsidian. She laughed freely, the sound bright and unguarded, and Adam answered with a smile that made her heart expand until it seemed the whole garden beat in time with it. They walked hand in hand along crystal streams, their bare feet sinking into moss softer than any woven cloth. They spoke of small wonders, the way dew clung to a leaf like a diamond, the slow unfurling of a blossom at dawn, and their voices mingled with the wind until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. She was curious by nature, this first woman, and God had not made her otherwise. Curiosity was not yet sin. It was the spark that let her name the flowers, trace the veins of a leaf, wonder at the way light fractured through water. Adam named the animals as they came before him, and she stood at his side, listening to the cadence of each name as though it were music. When the creatures departed, she would turn to him with questions that danced in her eyes, and he would answer as best he could, his voice steady with the certainty of one who had walked with God in the cool of the day. One afternoon, or what passed for afternoon, in a place untouched by shadow, the garden seemed to hold its breath. Eve wandered alone, drawn by a gentle restlessness she could not name. The air was thick with the scent of ripening fruit and sun-warmed earth. She passed groves where apples hung low. Their skins blushed crimson, but none called to her. She followed a narrow path lined with lilies until it opened onto a clearing she had never noticed before. At its center stood a tree unlike the others. Its trunk was smooth and silver-gray, its branches spreading wide in quiet dignity. The leaves were broad and dark green, and among them hung a single fruit, round, red, perfect. It gleamed as though lit from within, a quiet invitation in a garden already overflowing with bounty. A serpent lay coiled at the tree's base, its scales shimmering like burnished bronze. It lifted its head as she approached, eyes bright and unblinking. There was no malice in its gaze, only a patient curiosity that mirrored her own. It did not speak. Perhaps it could not. Or perhaps the moment required no words. Its presence simply drew her nearer, as though the tree had been waiting for her all along. Eve stood beneath the branches and looked up. The fruit seemed to pulse faintly, matching the rhythm of her heart. She had always known this tree was different, not through any spoken prohibition. God had never needed to thunder warnings across the garden, but through an inner knowing, soft as a whisper in the soul. This fruit was not for them. To take it would be to reach beyond the boundary of trust, to claim knowledge that belonged to the Creator alone. And yet, her hand rose of its own accord. Fingers brushed the smooth, warm skin of the apple. It felt alive beneath her touch, vibrant with promise. She lifted it to her lips. The first bite was crisp, startling. Juice flooded her mouth, sweet at first, then sharp, then something deeper, something metallic. She froze. The taste was not fruit at all. It was blood. Warm, thick, copper-bright blood, coating her tongue, sliding down her throat. Her eyes widened. She looked down at the apple in her hand. Where she had bitten, the flesh parted to reveal not white pith and seeds, but dark crimson that welled and dripped, staining her fingers. A hunger awoke inside her, sudden, ferocious, unlike anything she'd ever known. It was not in her stomach, but in her veins. A fire racing through every capillary, demanding more. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The world narrowed to the scent of life, the promise of relief. The serpent still watched. Without thought, without hesitation, Eve lunged. Her hands closed around the creature's sinuous body. It writhed once, a single graceful twist, then went still as she brought it to her mouth. Fangs, new, sharp, impossibly sharp, pierced scale and flesh. Hot blood poured over her tongue, rich and vital, quenching the blaze within her. She drank deeply, greedily, until the serpent's body slackened in her grasp, and its eyes dimmed. When she released it, the creature slipped lifeless to the grass. She stood, trembling. The change came swiftly. Her body stretched, bones lengthening with a soft liquid sound. Muscles shifted beneath her skin, coiling with new power. Her limbs grew longer, sleeker, every movement carrying an effortless grace. Her skin paled to luminous porcelain, flawless and cool, as though moonlight had been poured over her. Her dark hair thickened, gleaming with unnatural sheen. Her eyes, once warm brown, deepened to a fathomless black rimmed with gold, pupils contracting to slits before widening again in wonder. She was taller now, more beautiful in a way that felt both exalted and wrong. The garden's light seemed to bend around her, as though reluctant to touch her fully. Strength hummed in her limbs. She could hear the distant heartbeat of a deer 50 paces away, smell the faint iron tang of its blood on the breeze. And beneath it all, the thirst lingered. Not gone, only banked, waiting. Footsteps approached. Adam emerged from the trees, wiping soil from his hands. He had been tending vines farther down the path, humming softly to himself. His eyes found her and stopped. For a long moment, neither spoke. He saw the woman who had walked beside him since the beginning, yet she was no longer quite that woman. Taller, yes, more radiant. Her skin glowed with an unearthly pallor. Her gaze held a quiet intensity that made his breath catch. At her feet lay the serpent, lifeless. Nearby, on the grass, rested a single red apple, one bite missing. To Adam, it looked ordinary, perfectly ordinary fruit, untouched by blood or strangeness. But he was not a fool. He understood, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, what had happened. The tree, the fruit, the change in her. Envy rose in him, sharp, unexpected, bitter. She had crossed the boundary he had always respected. She had tasted what was forbidden, and it had made her more beautiful, more powerful, more alive in a way he suddenly craved with desperate hunger. He stepped forward. His hand reached for the apple. Chapter 2. The Bite of Envy. Adam's fingers closed around the apple. The fruit felt warm in his palm, ordinary in every way. Smooth red skin, a faint dusting of dew that had not yet evaporated in the garden's gentle air. No blood stained its surface. No strange darkness welled from the single bite Eve had taken. To him, it was simply fruit, beautiful and forbidden. The very thing that had remade the woman he loved into something more radiant, more powerful, more apart from him. He looked at her again. Eve stood motionless beneath the tree, taller now, her porcelain skin catching the light in a way that made her seem carved from moonlight rather than born of earth. Her eyes, those fathomless black and gold eyes, watched him with a mixture of fear and sorrow, as though she already understood what he would do. The serpent lay forgotten at her feet, a discarded husk. The garden around them remained perfect for one last heartbeat. Birds sang, leaves rustled, the distant rivers murmured their endless song. But something had shifted. The air felt thinner, expectant. Adam's chest tightened with a feeling he had never known before. Envy. It coiled in him like smoke, dark and acrid. She had crossed the line he had always honored. She had tasted what God had withheld, and the result was undeniable. Beauty sharpened to a blade, strength humming beneath her skin, a presence that made the rest of creation seem suddenly dim. He had walked beside her since the beginning, shared every breath of this paradise. Yet now she stood transformed, while he remained the same. Dust, shaped into man, mortal, limited. The whisper came again, softer than memory but unmistakable. You shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. He had always known the command, not as words shouted from the heavens, but as an inner certainty planted in his soul the moment God breathed life into him. Eve had known it too, yet she had reached, and she had not died. She had become. His hand lifted the apple to his lips. He hesitated only long enough to meet her gaze one final time. In her eyes, he saw the plea she could not voice. Don't. But the envy was louder. It promised him the same transcendence, the same escape from the quiet boundaries of what he had been made to be. He bit. The taste was sweet, ordinary sweetness, the crisp snap of fruit, juice bright on his tongue. Nothing more. No blood, no fire in the veins. For a single bewildered instant, he felt only disappointment. Then the world answered. The ground shuddered. A low groan rose from the earth itself, as though the garden's roots had been torn free. Trees swayed violently. Leaves rained down in green cascades. The crystal streams churned, their waters turning muddy and dark. Flowers wilted where they stood, petals curling inward like burning paper. Birds fell silent. The light, eternal golden light, flickered and failed. Day bled into sudden, unnatural night. Stars appeared overhead, cold and distant, watching. Adam dropped the apple. It rolled across the grass and came to rest beside its bitten twin. Eve reached for him instinctively, her longer fingers brushing his arm. Her touch was cool now, almost feverish in its contrast to the warmth he still carried. Adam. God's voice came then. Not gentle, not the familiar murmur that had walked with them in the cool of the day. This was thunder rolling across an empty sky, vast and final, shaking the marrow in their bones. Because you have done this, the ground is cursed because of you. The words struck like stones. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Adam felt the weight settle into his limbs, the promise of toil, of sweat, of an ending, mortality, once a distant shadow, now pressed close. The voice turned to Eve. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. But the words carried a deeper wound for her alone. Beneath the pronouncement of physical pain lay something more cruel. A tether, not to Adam, but to the very earth she had defiled. The garden itself recoiled from her. The life she had once drawn freely now rejected her touch. Thirst, true physical thirst, would stalk her veins forever. Strength would ebb the farther she strayed from this place. Sunlight, once a caress, would become fire on her skin, and the blood that now sang in her body would demand more blood, always more, a hunger no fruit could ever sate. You are bound to the unconsecrated ground, the voice continued, softer now, almost sorrowful. What was given in trust has been taken in rebellion. Depart. The garden convulsed one final time. A wind rose, hot and bitter, carrying the scent of dying leaves and scorched earth. Vines withered to brittle threads. The great trees bowed as though in grief. The rivers slowed, their waters sinking into cracked soil. Paradise folded in on itself, shrinking, shriveling, until what had been endless green became a desolate clearing, surrounded by thorn-choked wilderness. Adam and Eve stood in the ruins. Night pressed down, thick and starless save for a thin crescent moon that offered no comfort. The temperature dropped sharply. Eve's new skin prickled, though she no longer felt cold the way she once had. Adam shivered, suddenly aware of his nakedness in a way he never had before. He looked at her, really looked. She was still beautiful, achingly so, but the beauty now carried an edge of tragedy. Her porcelain features were perfect, eternal, yet her eyes held a grief so deep it seemed to swallow the starlight. She reached for his hand again, and this time he let her take it. We cannot stay, she whispered. He nodded, throat tight. They turned from the dying tree, from the lifeless serpent, from the garden that had been their home. Hand in hand, they stepped into the darkness beyond Eden's edge. Behind them, the last of the light guttered out. Ahead, lay only wilderness, rock and sand and thorn, and the long, uncharted road of consequence. Chapter 3: Shadows of Exile. The wilderness beyond Eden was not empty. It was vast and indifferent, a place of sharp stone and dry wind that carried the faint memory of smoke. Adam and Eve walked in silence for hours, guided only by the thin crescent moon and the instinct that kept them moving forward. Their bare feet bled on the jagged ground, his from thorns that had never before existed. Hers not at all, though the cuts closed almost as soon as they opened. Her body no longer bled the way his did. It simply healed, cool and efficient, as though the wound had been an inconvenience rather than an injury. They found the settlement near dawn. It was small, no more than a cluster of low mud brick houses huddled against a rocky outcrop. Smoke rose from a central fire pit, thin and grey in the paling sky. A few goats bleated softly in a pen of woven branches. Children slept in doorways wrapped in rough wool. The people here spoke a language close enough to their own, that meaning carried across the distance. Words for water, for bread, for shelter. A woman with lined hands and kind eyes saw them first. She rose from tending the fire, wiping ash from her palms, and approached without fear. She looked at Adam's dirt-streaked face, at Eve's unearthly pallor and towering grace, and asked no questions. She simply gestured toward an empty hut at the edge of the settlement, a single room with a low ceiling, a mat of woven reeds on the floor, and a small clay lamp that had long since burned out. "Rest," she said. "The night has been long." Adam thanked her in a voice hoarse from disuse. Eve could only nod. Her throat felt tight, not from thirst, not yet, but from the weight of everything unsaid. They entered the hut. The door, a simple reed curtain, fell closed behind them. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling faintly of dried herbs and old smoke. Adam sank onto the mat, exhaustion pulling at him like gravity. He reached for Eve's hand, but she remained standing near the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, as though to hold something in. "Lie down," he murmured. "We're safe for now." She did not answer. Instead, she watched him settle, watched the rise and fall of his chest as sleep claimed him almost at once. The moonlight that slipped through cracks in the walls painted silver stripes across his skin. His breathing deepened, steady and mortal. And then it began. At first, it was only a faint ache behind her eyes, a dryness in her mouth that water could not touch. She pressed her lips together and swallowed, but the sensation spread down her throat, into her chest, along the inside of her arms. It felt like fire moving through dry grass, slow at first, then faster, hungrier. Her veins seemed to constrict, pulling inward, demanding to be filled. She looked at Adam. His neck curved gently against the mat, pulse visible beneath the skin, slow, rhythmic, alive. The sound of it filled the small room, a soft, insistent drum that drowned out the distant bleating of goats, the crackle of the settlement's fire, the wind against the walls. She could smell him, salt and earth, and the faint sweetness of the garden still clinging to his hair. Beneath it all, richer than any fruit, was the copper promise of blood. Eve's hands clenched at her sides, nails, longer now, sharper, dug into her palms. She forced herself to turn away, pressing her forehead to the cool mud wall, the thirst sharpened into pain, a blade twisting just beneath her ribs. She imagined her teeth sinking into his throat, the hot rush that would follow, the relief that would flood her like cool water over burning sand. Horror followed the vision. She loved him. She had always loved him, since the moment God placed her hand in his and said, "This is bone of your bones, flesh of your flesh." That love had not vanished with the garden. If anything, it had grown heavier, more desperate, in the face of what she had become. She could not stay. Not here, not with him sleeping so close, so trusting, so fragile. Eve moved silently to the doorway. The reed curtain parted without sound. Outside, the settlement slept under a sky turning the color of bruised fruit. The fire had burned low. Embers glowed like fallen stars. She glanced back once, only once, at the shape of Adam on the mat, his arm flung out as though reaching for her even in dreams. Then she stepped into the night. The wilderness swallowed her without protest. She walked until the settlement's faint glow disappeared behind a rise of stone. The thirst followed, relentless, but distance dulled its edge just enough that she could think. She found a shallow cave, carved into the side of a low cliff, its mouth screened by dry scrub. Inside, the air was still and cool. She curled against the back wall, knees drawn to her chest, and waited for the dawn she already dreaded. Above her, the crescent moon watched without pity. She did not sleep. She simply endured, and somewhere in the settlement behind her, Adam dreamed of green leaves, of her laughter, of a world that no longer existed. Chapter 4. The Pull of the Earth. Dawn came slowly to the wilderness, a thin line of rose and gold bleeding along the eastern horizon. Eve remained curled in the shallow cave, back pressed to cool stone, knees drawn tight against her chest. She had not slept. Sleep, it seemed, was another gift the curse had quietly revoked. In its place came a restless awareness, every shift of sand outside, every distant cry of a nightbird settling for the day, every slow drip of moisture from the cave roof. Her senses had sharpened in the hours since she fled the settlement, though she felt no joy in it. The world had become louder, brighter, more insistent, and she had become smaller against it. The first true ray of sunlight touched the scrub at the cave's mouth. Pain lanced through her like a spear. It was not the gentle warmth she had once known in Eden. This was fire, pure, searing, crawling across her exposed skin as though the light itself had teeth. She recoiled deeper into shadow, gasping, arms raised to shield her face. Blisters rose and fell in seconds, healing almost before they fully formed, but the agony lingered in her nerves, a warning branded into flesh. She understood then. The sun was no longer her friend. It would burn her, weaken her, remind her with every dawn that she no longer belonged to the day. She waited until the light climbed higher, until the cave's interior grew dim, but safe. Only then did she venture out, moving in quick, darting steps from shadow to shadow, cloak of woven leaves and branches pulled tight around her shoulders. The wilderness stretched endless. Rocky hills, dry wadies, sparse acacia trees whose thorns caught at her like accusing fingers. She walked without direction at first, simply away, until an invisible tether tightened in her chest. She stopped. The sensation was physical, unmistakable, a dull ache blooming behind her sternum, spreading outward like roots seeking water. The farther she moved from the place where Eden had once stood, the stronger it grew. Her limbs felt heavier, her vision blurred at the edges. Strength that had hummed beneath her skin since the transformation began to ebb, as though her body were being slowly drained. She turned back instinctively, retracing her steps, and with each stride toward the ruined garden, the ache lessened. By the time the blackened outline of the dying trees appeared on the horizon, twisted skeletons against the sky, her steps had lightened, her breath steadied, the fire in her veins banked once more. She understood. The curse had not merely changed her, it had bound her. Eden's soil, unconsecrated now by her own hand, had become the only ground that would fully sustain her. Away from it, she would weaken, fade, grow brittle as old parchment. Closer to it she could breathe, move, endure. The tether was unbreakable, at least for now. She found a vantage point on a low ridge overlooking the place where paradise had ended. The garden was gone, truly gone. What remained was a wide, shallow depression ringed by thorns and cracked earth, the 4 rivers reduced to dry beds lined with salt. Yet something lingered, a faint pulse in the ground beneath her feet, a whisper of life that answered her presence. She knelt, pressed her palm to the soil. It was warm, almost welcoming. For the first time since the bite, a measure of peace touched her. Not forgiveness, but reprieve. She remained there through the morning, hidden among boulders, watching. Below, in the small settlement where she had left him, Adam stirred. He woke alone. The reed mat was cold beside him, the hut empty. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, calling her name once, softly. When no answer came, he rose and stepped outside. The settlement was already waking. Women drawing water, children chasing goats, men sharpening tools against stone. The kind-eyed woman who had offered them shelter saw him standing in the doorway and approached, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Your wife?" she asked gently. Adam shook his head, throat too tight for words. "She left in the night," the woman said. "I saw her shadow pass the fire. She looked afraid." He thanked her again, voice rough, and walked out beyond the houses. The wilderness stretched before him, vast and unforgiving. He did not know which way she had gone, only that she was gone. Grief settled into him like dust, quiet, pervasive, impossible to shake. Yet beneath it lay something else, resolve. The curse had promised toil, and toil he would embrace. He would work this hard earth, build something from it, prove that even cast out he could still live. He returned to the settlement and asked for work. A man with calloused hands and a short beard offered him a place in the fields, breaking soil, planting barley, tending the few date palms that survived the dry season. Adam accepted without hesitation. "Sweat," the voice had said, "bred by the sweat of his face." So be it. Eve watched from the ridge. She saw him walk the paths between houses, saw him take up a wooden hoe, saw the first swing of it into reluctant ground. She saw the way his shoulders moved, still strong, still familiar, and the way he paused now and then to look toward the wilderness, as though hoping to catch sight of her among the rocks. She did not go to him. She could not. The thirst had returned, quieter now but persistent, a low burn she could ignore only by focusing on the pulse of the earth beneath her. She hunted that afternoon. Small game, a hare startled from its burrow. She caught it easily, faster than she had ever moved before, and drank quickly. Grimacing at the thin, gamey taste, it eased the fire in her veins, but left her unsatisfied, hollow. Animal blood would keep her alive, she realized. but it would never fill the emptiness inside her. Night fell again. She returned to the ridge overlooking the settlement, hidden in darkness. Torches flickered below, voices carried on the wind, laughter, conversation, the ordinary sounds of people living. Adam sat by the central fire, eating bread and lentils from a clay bowl. He looked older already, though only a day had passed. Lines of weariness etched around his eyes, shoulders bowed by labor and loss. Eve's hand rose to her throat. She wanted to call out, to run down the slope and fold herself into his arms, to pretend the garden still existed and they were still the same. But the tether pulled both ways. To stay near him was to risk the thirst growing too strong. To leave entirely was to weaken until she could no longer stand. So she remained where she was, close enough to see, far enough to protect. She would watch, she would wait, and in the long nights ahead, she would learn the true shape of eternity. Not endless power, not immortal beauty, but endless longing for the one thing she could never again fully touch. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Distance. The days blurred into weeks, then months. Time in the wilderness moved differently, slow and relentless, marked not by seasons, but by the gradual hardening of the land and the slow softening of memory. Eve made her home in the shadowed places that ringed the old garden, a shallow ravine where boulders formed natural walls, a narrow cave whose mouth faced east, so the morning light never reached its depths, a cluster of ancient acacias whose twisted branches offered dappled shade at noon. She moved between them like a ghost, always within sight of the blackened depression that had once been Eden, always feeling the faint pulse of its soil beneath her feet, like a second heartbeat. She never strayed far enough to weaken again. The tether held her close, a cruel mercy. Closer to the ruined ground, her strength returned in full, limbs light, senses keen, the porcelain of her skin luminous even in shadow. Farther away the ache returned, bones growing heavy, vision dimming at the edges until she turned back. She learned the boundaries the way a tethered animal learns its chain. Invisible, unyielding, absolute. Hunger became routine. She hunted at twilight and dawn, when the sun was low and the world grey. Hares, ibex, the occasional desert fox, swift creatures that required little chase. She caught them with hands that moved faster than thought, fangs piercing fur and flesh in a single motion. The blood was thin, metallic, never quite enough. It quieted the fire in her veins for hours, sometimes a full day, but left a hollow ache behind, a whisper that human blood would be richer, warmer, more complete. She pushed the thought away each time it rose. She would not feed on the people below. Not while Adam lived among them. She watched him every night. From the ridge above the settlement, she could see the flicker of their central fire, the shapes of bodies moving in the torchlight. Adam had grown into the rhythm of their life. His hands, once soft from Eden's abundance, were now calloused and scarred. He worked the fields from first light until the sun sank, breaking stubborn soil, planting barley and lentils, hauling water from the shallow well they had dug. In the evenings, he sat with the others, sharing bread, listening to stories of distant tribes, laughing quietly at the children's games. His face had changed, lines etched deeper around his eyes and mouth, hair touched with the first threads of grey. Yet the way he moved remained familiar, the careful set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head when he listened. the small gesture of rubbing his thumb across his knuckles when he was thinking. Eve memorized every detail. She began leaving trinkets. The first was simple, a smooth river stone, polished by years in one of the dried riverbeds, placed on the flat rock he used as a seat beside the field at dawn. He found it the next morning, turned it over in his hands, brow furrowing. She watched from the shadows as he held it to the light, as recognition flickered across his face. Not certainty, but something close, a memory of Eden's streams, of stones they had once skipped across water together. He slipped it into the pouch at his belt and carried it all day. The next was a single bloom, a desert lily she had found growing improbably in a crack of stone near the old garden's edge. Its petals were pale gold, fragile as paper. She laid it on the threshold of his hut while he slept, then retreated to the ridge. When he stepped outside at sunrise, he stopped, knelt, lifted the flower gently between thumb and forefinger. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he pressed it to his lips, closed his eyes, and whispered her name into the still air. Eve felt the sound travel across the distance like a physical touch. She continued. A feather from a hawk's wing, iridescent black and white, left on the path he took to the well. A sprig of dried myrrh, its scent faint but unmistakable, tucked beneath the mat inside his door. A shard of obsidian, sharp-edged and gleaming, placed where he would find it while weeding. Each one was small, silent, anonymous to anyone but him. Each one said the same thing. I am here. I have not forgotten. I cannot come closer. He never spoke of them to the others. He kept them in a small clay jar beneath his sleeping mat. Stone beside feather, beside dried blossom, beside obsidian. Sometimes, late at night when the settlement slept, he would take the jar outside and sit by the dying fire, turning the objects over in his hands as though they were relics of a life he could still reach. Eve watched him do this, night after night. The sight of it broke something inside her each time, a fresh fracture in a heart that refused to die. She wanted to descend the ridge, cross the open ground, step into the circle of firelight, and let him see what she had become. She wanted to feel his arms around her again, to hear him say her name without the catch of grief in his voice. But the thirst was always there, banked, waiting. One moment of weakness, one slip of control, and she might take from him what she could never give back. So she stayed on the periphery, a shadow among shadows, a whisper carried on the wind. Months became years. The settlement grew slowly. More children born, more huts raised, new fields carved from the stubborn earth. Adam became a quiet pillar among them, the man who never tired, who worked longer than most, who shared what little he had without complaint. They called him the gardener, though the soil here yielded grudgingly and never without sweat. He smiled when they used the name, but the smile never reached his eyes. Eve watched the grey spread in his hair, the slight stoop that entered his shoulders, the way his steps grew more deliberate. She watched him age while she remained unchanged. Porcelain skin unlined, dark hair still gleaming, body still strong and sleek and eternal. And each night, when the fire burned low and the settlement slept, she returned to her ridge. She left another trinket, and somewhere in the darkness, Adam reached for it, turned it over in his worn hands, and remembered a woman who had once walked beside him in a garden that no longer existed. The tether held. The thirst waited. and eternity stretched ahead, long, silent, and unbearably alone. Chapter 6. The Shadow of Another. Years turned like pages in a book no one else could read. The settlement grew into a small village. Huts multiplied, fields expanded, a low stone wall rose to keep stray goats from wandering too far. Children who had once toddled after Adam now ran ahead of him, calling him uncle with easy affection. He taught them how to plant seeds in straight rows, how to read the sky for rain, how to mend a broken hoe without wasting iron. His hands bore the permanent marks of labor, knuckles thickened, palms etched with fine white scars. His hair had silvered completely, falling in waves to his shoulders when he worked shirtless in the heat. Yet his eyes remained the same, clear, searching, always lifting toward the ridge at dusk, as though expecting to see a familiar silhouette against the fading light. Eve watched it all from her shadowed places. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of observation, the slow arc of the sun across the sky, the nightly gathering around the fire, the quiet moments when Adam sat alone with his jar of trinkets. She no longer left them as often, once every few weeks now, when the ache in her chest became too sharp to ignore. Each offering was simpler, a single acorn polished smooth, a feather bleached white by the sun, a fragment of quartz that caught the moonlight like a captured star. He still found them. He still kept them. The jar beneath his mat grew fuller, a silent archive of her presence. Then came Lilith. She arrived with a small caravan from the north, 3 families fleeing drought, bearing bundles of dried figs, bolts of dyed wool, and stories of distant rivers that still ran clear. Lilith was among them, a woman of average height, with skin the warm brown of sun-baked clay and hair braided with red thread. Her hands were quick and sure, skilled at the loom. She wove patterns of interlocking vines and stars that made the other women pause in admiration. Her laugh was low and warm, the kind that invited others to join without demanding it. She moved through the village with quiet confidence, offering help where it was needed, asking little in return. Adam noticed her first in the communal field. She had taken up a hoe beside him one morning, matching his steady rhythm without comment. When the sun climbed high, they rested together in the shade of a date palm, sharing water from the same skin. He spoke to her of the soil, how it resisted at first, but learned to yield with patience. She listened, nodding, then told him of the northern hills where wild thyme grew thick and the wind carried the scent of pine. Their conversation was ordinary, gentle, the kind 2 people have when they are beginning to see each other clearly. Eve saw it from the ridge. She felt the shift before she could name it, a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with thirst. She watched Lilith's hand brush Adam's arm as she passed him a tool. She watched the way he smiled, small, private, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way they had not since Eden. She watched them walk back to the village together at dusk, shoulders almost touching, voices low against the evening wind. Jealousy came like a slow poison. It was not rage, not yet. It was quieter, more corrosive. The knowledge that someone else now occupied the space beside him filled the silences she had left empty. Lilith was not cruel. She was not seductive in any calculated way. She was simply there, kind, steady, human. She aged as he did, laughed at the same small things, shared the same mortal weariness after a long day. She could grow old with him. She could bear children whose laughter would echo through his house. She could hold his hand when the years grew heavy and death drew near. Eve could offer none of those things. She began to vilify Lilith in her own mind, not with venomous words, but with the bitter lens of loss. She told herself Lilith had stolen him, though she knew it was not theft when the one who left was herself. She told herself Lilith could never understand the depth of what they had shared in the garden, though she knew no one could. She watched them share meals by the fire, watched Lilith rest her head briefly against Adam's shoulder one evening, when the night grew cold, watched him drape his cloak around her without hesitation. Each moment carved deeper. One night, after the village slept, Eve descended closer than she ever had before. She moved silently through the outer fields, past the low wall, until she stood at the edge of the settlement's torchlight. From there, she could see into Adam's hut through the open doorway. He sat on his mat, back against the wall, the clay jar open in his lap. He lifted the polished river stone, the first trinket she had left, and turned it slowly between his fingers. His expression was soft, almost tender, the way it had been when they walked together beneath Eden's trees. Lilith appeared in the doorway, carrying a small oil lamp. She paused, seeing the jar, the stone in his hand. She did not ask. Instead, she knelt beside him, placed the lamp on the floor, and rested her hand lightly on his wrist. He looked at her, eyes glistening in the low light. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he set the stone carefully back into the jar, closed the lid, and leaned his head against hers. Eve turned away. She walked back through the darkness, steps mechanical, throat burning with a thirst that had nothing to do with blood. She climbed the ridge, found her accustomed perch among the boulders, and sat staring at the village below until the first grey light of dawn forced her into shadow. She did not leave another trinket that week, or the next. The jar beneath Adam's mat remained closed for many nights. Yet she could not leave entirely. The tether of the earth held her, the deeper tether of love that had outlived paradise, held her tighter still. She watched from farther back now, hidden among the higher rocks, where the details blurred, but the shapes remained unmistakable. Two figures walking side by side, two heads bent close over shared work, two hands clasped in the firelight. Lilith was not a villain. She was simply the woman who stayed. Eve was the one who had bitten the fruit, drunk the serpent dry, and walked away into the night. The curse had promised pain in childbearing. Eve felt its first echo then, not in her womb, but in her heart, the longing to create something that would outlast loss, something that might fill the silence Adam's absence had carved inside her. But she pushed the thought down. Not yet. Not while he still breathed, still smiled, still lived a life she could only watch from the edges. She remained on the periphery, a silent witness, a shadow cast by a love that refused to die, even as the man it belonged to began, slowly, to live again without her. Chapter 7. Echoes of Eternity. Decades slipped past like sand through open fingers. The village became a small town. Stone houses replaced mud brick huts. A marketplace appeared at the crossroads, where traders from the north bartered copper tools for wool and dates. Wells were deepened, cisterns built, olive groves planted on the slopes where thorns once ruled. Children grew into men and women, married, bore children of their own. Names changed, faces aged, but the land remembered. The same stubborn soil Adam had first broken, with his hands still yielded grudgingly, still demanded sweat. Adam grew old. His hair was now fully white, worn long and tied back with a leather thong. His shoulders, once broad and unbowed, had rounded with time. His steps carried the careful deliberation of joints that ached after rain. The lines on his face told stories he never spoke aloud, years of labor, quiet joys, deeper sorrows. Yet his hands remained strong, steady enough to guide a plough, gentle enough to cradle a grandchild on his knee. The people called him elder now, sought his counsel on planting seasons and disputes over grazing rights. He gave it freely, voice low and measured, the same voice that had once named every creature in Eden. Lilith aged beside him. Her braids had thinned to silver threads. Her laugh, though softer, still warmed the room. They had built a life together, a house with 2 rooms and a small courtyard shaded by a fig tree. Children who had grown and scattered. Grandchildren who ran through the dust, calling for stories. She wove still, her loom set near the doorway so she could watch the street while her fingers worked the threads. When the days grew short, she sat with Adam by the hearth, their hands clasped without need for words. Their love had settled into something quiet and enduring, like roots deep in dry earth. Eve watched from the high places. She had retreated farther back over the years, not out of choice, but necessity. The town had expanded. New fields pushed toward the ridge. New eyes scanned the horizon for goats or strangers. She kept to the upper slopes now, among wind-scoured boulders and sparse juniper, where the tether still reached, but the details blurred. She could no longer see the individual lines of Adam's face from there, only the shape of him, the slow walk to the fields each morning, the silhouette by the fire at night, the way he paused sometimes to look toward the hills, as though listening for a voice long silenced. The trinkets had stopped entirely. The last one, a small piece of amber she had found washed down from some distant mountain, had been placed on the windowsill of their house more than 10 years earlier. Adam had found it at dawn, held it to the light until the golden resin glowed like captured sunlight, then carried it inside without a word. She never saw it again. Perhaps it joined the others in the clay jar beneath the mat. Perhaps Lilith had asked about it one quiet evening, and he had told her the truth, or part of it. Eve did not know. She did not dare come close enough to learn. The thirst had grown familiar, almost companionable. Animal blood sustained her, ibex on the high slopes, desert hares in the wadis, the occasional lost lamb straying too far from the flock. She drank quickly, efficiently, never lingering over the act. The taste remained thin, unsatisfying, but it kept the fire at bay. She had learned to ration it, to hunt only when the burn became unbearable. Human blood she refused to consider, not out of virtue alone, but because the thought of taking from anyone in that town felt like desecration. They were his people now. They carried traces of him in their laughter, their stories, the way they worked the same earth he had taught them to tame. Strength came slowly, unbidden. Years of feeding, even on lesser blood, had deepened her abilities. She moved faster than any mortal eye could track when she chose to. She heard heartbeats from across valleys, smelled fear or illness on the wind, long before symptoms appeared. Her night vision was absolute. Colors in moonlight were as vivid as they had been in Eden's day, yet none of it brought joy. power without purpose was only another layer of isolation, she remained beautiful, porcelain skin unmarred, hair dark and lustrous, body sleek and eternal. But beauty had become a mirror that reflected only absence. She thought often of creation. The curse had spoken of pain in childbearing, and though her body would never swell with mortal life, the words echoed in her loneliness. She imagined biting someone, not to kill, but to share the gift she carried. Immortality, strength, freedom from age. The thought terrified her. What right did she have to curse another as she had been cursed? What if the new life hated her for it, as she sometimes hated the God who'd allowed the fruit to hang within reach? Yet the silence grew heavier each year. Adam's life was finite. Hers was not. The emptiness inside her widened with every passing season. One evening, near the end of a long summer, she descended closer than she had in years. The town slept under a sky thick with stars. She moved through the outer olive groves, silent as shadow, until she reached the low wall behind Adam and Lilith's house. The fig tree in their courtyard had grown tall. Its leaves rustled softly in the night breeze. Through the open window, she could see them. Adam seated on a low stool, Lilith standing behind him, her fingers working through his white hair in slow rhythmic strokes. He leaned back against her, eyes closed, the lines of his face softened by exhaustion and contentment. Eve stood frozen. She could smell them both, earth and wool, and the faint sweetness of figs. She could hear the slow, steady beat of their hearts, synchronized after so many years together. For one reckless moment, she imagined stepping through the doorway, letting them see her, the woman who had once been their beginning, now unchanged while they had lived entire lives without her. She did not move. Instead, she reached into the pouch at her waist and withdrew the last thing she had carried for him, a single leaf from one of Eden's descendants, a stubborn myrtle that still grew near the old garden's edge. Its green was deep, almost black in the moonlight. She placed it on the windowsill, gentle as a breath, then stepped back into the darkness. She climbed the slope without looking behind her. At the top, she paused, turned, and looked down one final time. The house was small from here, a warm glow in a sea of night. 2 figures inside, close and quiet. 2 lives entwined, growing old together. Eve pressed her palm to the stone beneath her feet. The tether pulsed, faint, steady, eternal. She was bound to this place, to this man, to a love that had outlived paradise itself. And still, she waited. Not for return, not for forgiveness, only for the day when the fire in the courtyard finally went out, when the house stood empty, when the last echo of his heartbeat faded from the earth. Then, perhaps, she would know what came next. Until then, she remained, unchanging, watching, remembering. Chapter 8. The Agony of Creation. The seasons turned again, indifferent to the ache that had settled permanently in Eve's chest. Winter came with thin, cold winds that scoured the hills and drove the townspeople indoors earlier each evening. Fires burned longer. Stories grew taller. Adam's voice, though quieter now, still carried across the courtyard when he spoke to his grandchildren. Tales of a green place long ago, where rivers never ran dry and fruit hung ripe without coaxing. The children listened wide-eyed, half believing, half dismissing it as the fancy of an old man who had once been strong. Eve listened too. From her high perch, she caught fragments carried on the wind, words like garden, tree, loss. She wondered if he ever spoke her name aloud in those stories, or if she had become only a shadow in them, a figure who walked away and never returned. The thought no longer cut as deeply as it once had. Time had worn the edges smooth, like river stone. What remained was a dull, constant pressure, loneliness so vast it felt like another organ inside her, beating in time with the thirst. She had begun to experiment. Not recklessly, not yet, but the silence had grown unbearable, and the curse's promise of pain in childbearing echoed louder with every passing year. She could not bear children the way mortal women did. Her body refused to change in that way, yet the words had carried a deeper meaning, one she felt stirring now, the capacity to create life of a different kind, to pass on the gift or the affliction that had been forced upon her. She chose carefully. The first was a wanderer, a young man who had come to the town seeking work after a raid had burned his village to the ground. He was tall, lean, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a quiet grief that reminded her faintly of her own. He slept in the communal barn on the outskirts, worked the olive presses during the day, spoke little to anyone. She watched him for weeks. His careful movements, the way he paused sometimes to stare toward the hills as though searching for something lost. He reminded her of Adam in the earliest days after the fall, weary, determined, alone. One moonless night she approached. She moved through the darkness like water, silent, inevitable. He was sitting outside the barn, back against the wall, staring at the stars. She stepped into his line of sight slowly, letting him see her fully, the porcelain skin that glowed faintly in the starlight, the height and grace that no longer seemed entirely human, the eyes that held depths no mortal gaze could match. He did not run. He rose slowly, hands open at his sides. "Who are you?" he asked, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Someone who knows what it is to lose everything," she answered. They spoke for hours, low voices, careful words. She told him fragments, a garden, a choice, a curse that bound her to this place. She did not speak of Adam. She did not need to. The man, his name was Eli, listened without interruption, without fear. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "I have nothing left," he said at last. "No family, no home. If what you offer is life without end, I would take it." She hesitated. The thirst rose then, not the animal hunger she had learned to manage, but something sharper, more intimate. She stepped closer. He did not flinch. She lifted her hand to his cheek. His skin was warm, alive, pulsing with the steady rhythm she had once known so well. "I cannot promise it will be kind," she whispered. "I do not ask for kindness," he replied, "only for it to end." She leaned in. Her fangs pierced the soft skin at the curve of his throat. Blood flooded her mouth, richer than any animal's, hotter, sweeter, alive with memory and pain and hope. She drank only enough to weaken him, then drew back. With a small, deliberate motion, she scored her own wrist, pressed it to his lips. He drank. The change was immediate and brutal. Eli convulsed against her, body arching as though lightning had passed through him. Bones shifted with wet, grinding sounds, muscles knotted and lengthened, Skin paled to a luminous pallor that matched her own. His eyes, storm grey, darkened to black, rimmed with gold, pupils dilating wildly before focusing with unnatural clarity. When it ended, he collapsed to his knees, gasping, trembling, newly tall and sleek and beautiful in the same tragic way she was. He looked up at her. There was no gratitude in his gaze, only a stunned recognition of what he had become. The thirst was already there, burning behind his eyes. She felt it echo in her own veins, a shared agony. "I'm sorry," she said. He laughed once, a short, broken sound. "Don't be. I asked for this." She helped him to his feet. They moved away from the town, back toward the high slopes where the tether still held her strongest. There, in the shelter of a narrow ravine, she taught him how to hunt without killing if he chose, how to endure the sun's fire by seeking shadow, how the earth itself would pull at him if he strayed too far from the old garden's scar. He learned quickly. The curse had made him strong, fast, eternal, but it had also made him hers, in a way no mortal bond could match. She felt the first faint thread of companionship, fragile as new thread on a loom. It was not love. It was necessity. Over the months that followed, others came. A woman whose husband had died in childbirth, leaving her hollow with grief. A boy, barely grown, orphaned by fever. A trader who had seen too much violence on the roads and no longer trusted sleep. Eve did not seek them out. They found her. Word traveled in whispers, tales of a woman in the hills who offered life beyond death, who asked only for loyalty and silence. Each time the act was the same, the bite, the sharing of blood, the agony of transformation. Each time the pain in her body mirrored the pain in theirs, sharp contractions deep inside, as though her womb were trying to birth something it could never hold. The curse kept its promise. Childbearing brought suffering, even when the children were not flesh of her flesh. They gathered around her slowly. Not a court, not yet, just a small band of the changed. 5, then 7, then 10, living in the shadowed places above the town. They hunted together, shared knowledge, watched the world below with eyes that no longer aged. They called her mother in quiet moments, though she flinched from the word. She was no mother. She was the first, the cursed, the one who had opened the door none of them could close again. Below in the town, Adam grew frailer. He walked with a stick now, leaned on Lilith's arm when the path grew steep. His grandchildren carried him to the courtyard on warm days so he could sit beneath the fig tree and feel the sun on his face. He spoke less of the garden now. The stories had become private, shared only with Lilith in the quiet hours before sleep. Eve watched from the ridge, Eli and the others at her back like silent sentinels. She no longer left trinkets. There was no need. The clay jar beneath Adam's mat had long since been filled, its contents a secret archive no one else would ever see. She had given him what she could, memory, presence, the knowledge that she had never truly left. Now she had others who shared her eternity. The loneliness had not vanished. It had only changed shape. Where once there had been only absence, now there was company bound by the same curse, the same thirst, the same endless horizon. She wondered, sometimes, if this was what God had intended when he spoke of pain in childbearing. Not joy, not legacy, only the slow, inevitable multiplication of sorrow. And still she waited. For the day when Adam's fire finally dimmed, when the house stood empty, when the tether might finally loosen enough for her to step away. Until then, she remained. Mother to the changed. Guardian of a silence that grew louder with every new heartbeat that no longer aged. Chapter 9. Fading Light. The fig tree in the courtyard had grown thick and heavy with age. Its branches now arched over the low stone wall, leaves broad and dark, dropping fruit in late summer that stained the ground purple. Adam no longer climbed the ladder to pick the highest ones. His knees had betrayed him years ago, and his balance followed soon after. Instead, one of his grandsons, a boy named Micah, with Adam's steady hands and Lilith's quiet smile, would scale the branches each harvest, tossing the ripest figs down into a woven basket, while Adam watched from below, seated on a low bench carved from olive wood. Eve watched, too. From the upper ridge, she could see the entire scene in miniature, the old man leaning forward on his stick, white hair catching the afternoon sun like frost, the boy laughing as figs rained around them, Lilith appearing at the doorway with a shawl around her shoulders to cool them both inside before the evening chill settled. The house had not changed much. Same mud-plastered walls, same reed roof, but the life within it had slowed to a gentle, inevitable cadence. Meals were smaller now, conversations shorter, sleep longer. Adam's steps had become measured shuffles. Lilith's hands trembled slightly when she poured water or threaded her loom. Yet they moved together still, two bodies that had learned each other's rhythms over decades, orbiting one another with the ease of long habit. Eve felt every change like a fresh wound. She had not descended in years. The town below had swelled into a proper settlement. More houses, a small temple of sun-baked brick where people offered grain and oil to gods whose names she did not know. Traders who came and went with news of distant cities. Her small band of the changed had grown cautious. They hunted farther afield now, avoiding the expanding fields and the shepherds who watched the hills at night. Eli remained closest to her side, silent and loyal, his storm-grey eyes always scanning the horizon as though expecting trouble. The others followed her lead without question, hunting in packs, sharing blood when the thirst grew too fierce, speaking of her in hushed tones as the first, the mother, the queen they had not yet crowned. She rarely spoke of Adam to them. Some knew fragments, that a man lived below whom she had once loved, that she watched him still, that his mortality was the tether that kept her bound here long after others might have wandered. They did not press. The curse had taught them patience. Eternity dulled curiosity into something quieter, more resigned. One winter evening, illness came. It began as a cough, dry at first, then wet and rattling. Adam took to his bed, propped against pillows stuffed with wool and dried herbs. Lilith sat beside him day and night, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, spooning broth past lips that had grown thin. The grandchildren gathered in the courtyard, whispering prayers to whatever gods they believed in, while neighbors brought offerings of honey and oil. Eve watched from the ridge as the light in their house burned longer each night, a small, defiant glow against the dark. She descended then, closer than she had dared in decades. She moved through the olive groves under cover of moonless sky, past the low wall, until she stood in the shadow of the fig tree. The house was quiet, save for the soft murmur of Lilith's voice, reading from a scroll of Psalms. Through the open window, Eve could see Adam's face, pale, sunken, eyes half closed, but still bright with the same clear gaze that had once looked at her in Eden, and seen only wonder. Lilith noticed the change in his breathing first. She set the scroll aside, took his hand, and leaned close. "I am here," she whispered. "Always here." Adam's lips moved. No sound came at first. Then, faintly, "Eve." Lilith did not flinch. She had known the name for years, had seen the clay jar, had felt the weight of it in the silences between them. She squeezed his hand gently. "She is still watching over you," she said, voice steady. "She always has." Eve pressed her palm to the rough trunk of the fig tree, nails digging into bark. The words struck deeper than any thirst ever had. Lilith spoke them without bitterness, without claim. She spoke them as truth. Adam's chest rose once, twice, then stilled. Lilith bowed her head. No sob escaped her, only a long quiet exhale, as though she had been holding her breath for years and could finally release it. She kissed his forehead, smoothed his white hair back from his face, and sat with him until the first grey light of dawn touched the courtyard. Eve remained in the shadows until the family began to arrive. She watched them wash his body, anoint it with oil, wrap it in clean linen. She watched them carry him to the small burial ground beyond the town wall, a place of low mounds and simple stones consecrated by prayers and memory. Lilith walked at the head of the procession, steady despite the tremor in her hands. When they lowered him into the earth, she placed a single fig leaf on his chest before the soil covered him. Eve did not approach. She could not. The revulsion came then, not from the grave itself, but from the consecrated ground around it. The air thickened, pressing against her skin like holy oil turned acid. Nausea rose in her throat. Her limbs grew heavy, the tether of the old garden pulling harder to draw her back. She retreated up the slope, breath shallow, until the sensation faded. Lilith did not long survive him. Grief took her quietly, a few seasons later. She slipped away in her sleep one winter night, found by Micah at dawn, with a small smile still on her lips, as though she had dreamed of reunion. They buried her beside Adam, the two mounds side by side beneath the same myrtle that had once provided a leaf for a windowsill. Eve stood at the edge of the burial ground that night, just beyond the consecrated line. The revulsion was still there, sharp, warning, but she endured it long enough to see the fresh earth, the two stones now bearing their names. She placed nothing on the graves. There were no more trinkets left to give. The house stood empty for a time. Micah and his family moved in eventually, tending the fig tree, keeping the hearth lit. Life continued below, children laughing, goats bleating, the marketplace filling with voices. But the light in that particular courtyard never burned quite as brightly again. Eve returned to the ridge. Eli waited there, silent as always. The others had gathered farther back, respecting the space she needed. She sat on the familiar boulder, knees drawn up, staring down at the town that had once been a handful of mud huts. Adam was gone. Lilith was gone. The tether remained, bound to the unconsecrated scar of Eden, but it felt looser now, less like a chain and more like a thread worn thin by time. The thirst was still there, banked but eternal. Her strength had deepened with every feeding, every shared drop of blood among her growing kin. Senses sharper, movements swifter, beauty more absolute, yet none of it mattered. She had watched him live. She had watched him love again. She had watched him die. and in the silence that followed, something inside her finally shifted, not breaking, not healing, but changing shape. The loneliness had not ended. It had only become something she could carry. She rose slowly. The others watched her, waiting. She looked once more toward the graves, then turned her gaze to the horizon, toward lands she had never seen, toward centuries that stretched ahead like an open road. For the first time in decades, she felt the pull of something beyond the ridge. Not freedom, not yet, but possibility. She stepped forward. The tether stretched, but did not snap. She walked on. Chapter 10. The Final Vigil. The graves remained side by side beneath the myrtle tree, two low mounds of earth now softened by time and rain. Moss had begun to creep along the edges of the stones. Wildflowers, small white stars and pale blue bells, pushed up between the cracks each spring without anyone tending them. The town had not forgotten Adam and Lilith. Children still left offerings at the burial ground, a handful of dates, a polished pebble, a braided cord of wool. Micah and his descendants kept the path clear, the weeds pulled, the names recarved when wind and weather blurred the letters. They spoke of the elders with quiet reverence, as though their lives had anchored something essential in the soil. Eve came at night. She no longer feared the consecrated ground as sharply as she once had. The revulsion remained, a cold nausea that pressed against her temples, a faint burning where sunlight had once warmed her, but she had learned to endure it. She stood just beyond the boundary line, close enough to see the faint outlines of the stones in the moonlight, close enough to smell the earth that held what remained of him. She did not weep. Tears had dried up long ago, perhaps when the last trinket had been placed, perhaps when his final breath had left the house. What remained was a stillness deeper than sorrow, the knowledge that the tether, once iron, had become gossamer. The pull of the unconsecrated scar of Eden still held her body to this place, but the deeper chain, the one forged in love and loss, had begun to fray. Adam was gone. Lilith was gone. The house still stood, inhabited by strangers who carried his blood, but not his memories. The courtyard fig tree bore fruit each year, but no one sat beneath it any more to tell stories of a green world long vanished. She had watched his decline in fragments, the slowing steps, the days spent in bed, the final stillness. She had watched Lilith follow soon after, gentle and unresisting, as though she had only waited long enough to ensure he was not alone in the dark. Eve had stood vigil through both burials, hidden among the myrtle branches, feeling the consecrated earth push against her like a hand held out in warning. She had not approached the open graves. She had not placed a hand on the soil that covered him, but she had been there, silent, unchanging, eternal witness to the end of the only mortal life that had ever truly mattered to her. Now the graves were quiet. The town slept. Eve stepped forward one last time, crossing the invisible line into the burial ground. The nausea rose sharp and immediate, twisting in her gut, but she forced herself to stand over the twin mounds. Moonlight silvered the stones. The names carved there looked almost new in the pale glow. Adam. Lilith. She knelt between them, knees sinking into the soft earth. Her fingers brushed the soil above his resting place, cool, damp, ordinary dirt that had once been part of the garden they had lost together. She pressed her palm flat, feeling for any echo of the heartbeat she had once known better than her own. There was nothing, only silence, deep and final. For the first time in what seemed like centuries, she spoke his name aloud. Adam. The word hung in the night air, soft as breath. No answer came. No wind stirred the myrtle leaves. The tether in her chest tightened once, fiercely, then loosened, as though the earth itself had finally acknowledged that the man who had bound her here no longer needed her vigil. She rose. The nausea ebbed as she stepped back beyond the boundary. Her body felt lighter, unburdened, though the thirst still simmered beneath her skin and the pull of Eden's scar remained. She turned toward the high ridge one final time, scanning the familiar slope where she had perched for so many years. Eli waited there, a dark silhouette against the stars, the others gathered behind him like shadows given form. They had grown in number. Dozens now, scattered across the hills, drawn to her by whispers and need and the shared curse. They looked to her not as a mother, not anymore, but as something older. The first, the one who had opened the door and could not close it again. She walked toward them. Each step carried her farther from the graves, farther from the town, farther from the life she had watched unfold without her. The tether stretched, but did not break. She could feel Eden's scar calling her back, demanding she not stray too far. Yet, the distance no longer felt impossible. She could wander now if she chose, cross deserts, follow rivers, seek lands where no one knew the name of the first man or the woman who had loved him. First, though, she needed something practical. She returned to the ravine where her small band kept their hidden camp. There, in a cleft of rock screened by juniper, she knelt and began to gather soil from the edge of the old garden's scar. The earth was dark, rich with the memory of rivers and fruit and endless light. She worked carefully, filling a small wooden chest she had taken from a trader years earlier, line by line, handful by handful, until it was full. The soil smelled faintly of Eden still. Green, alive, promising. She sealed the chest. Then she found a larger box among the belongings they had accumulated. Plain cedar, unadorned, long enough to hold a body if need be. She lined it with woolen blankets, placed the chest of soil inside, and arranged the blankets around it, so the box appeared empty to any casual glance. A coffin, the mortals called such things. Practical for travel. No one questioned a grieving widow who carried her husband's remains in a sealed box, seeking a place to lay him to rest far from home. No one would open it. No one would touch it. And within it, the soil would keep her strong when the tether grew thin. She closed the lid. Eli approached, silent as always. "We leave?" he asked. She nodded once. "Where?" "Anywhere," she said. "Everywhere. The world is larger than this ridge." They prepared quietly. The others gathered what little they needed. Cloaks, water skins filled with blood they had hunted and stored, weapons for show more than use. Dawn was still hours away. They would move under cover of darkness, slipping past the town while it slept. Eve took the coffin herself. It was heavier than it should have been for one woman to carry alone, but her strength had deepened over time. She lifted it easily, balanced it on her shoulder, and walked down the slope for the last time. The others followed in a loose line, shadows among shadows. They passed the burial ground without stopping. Eve did not look back. The tether pulled, but she walked on. At the edge of the settlement, where the road branched toward the great rivers and the sea beyond, she paused. The town lay quiet behind her, fires banked, houses dark, the fig tree standing sentinel over an empty courtyard. She felt no farewell rise in her throat, only a quiet certainty. This chapter was finished. The road ahead was open. She shifted the coffin's weight and stepped onto the path that led away from everything she had ever known. Toward unknown lands, toward centuries that no longer carried his heartbeat, toward whatever came next.